Welcome to the Casting Beyond the Sea podcast, the show that talks about relationships and marriage. I'm Bob. Today we're talking about Sexual Detox. This is a book by Tim Challies called Sexual Detox, a guide for guys who are sick of porn. He chose this topic in this particular book because I think it meshes well with my channel Love Beyond the Sea, and because I agree with his conclusions. We must confront and talk about pornography because it stands in the way of a man ever experiencing the goodness of marital intimacy and the benefits of that to the whole relationship. Please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and following me on Twitter and Facebook so you can stay connected with me and keep up to date with all the latest podcasts, videos on the YouTube channel, and relationship and marriage advice that can only be found here on Casting Beyond the Sea. Today we will be looking at Chapter 2, so I will cover pornography versus marriage. He has a section about marriage not being a solution to pornography, and he makes the statement that getting free and staying free are different things. I will conclude by asking two questions out of his list from the last part of every chapter called Think. I will also interject some of my own thoughts as we go. So Chapter 2 of the book, Sexual Detox, a guide for guys who are sick of porn. Today it's marriage versus pornography. And this is Chapter 2 in his book. It starts on page 23. Porn is so prevalent that it's nearly certain every young man will find it. And once it has been tasted, it is difficult not to indulge. Then, as they say, life eventually imitates art. A young man enters into marriage with his mind full of pornographic images and his heart filled with the abstractions and deceptions of pornographic fantasies. Having seen dozens, maybe hundreds, thousands of sex acts in a pornographic setting, he loads the perverse baggage of porn star expectations onto his wife. The young husband more or less assumes his wife will commit any sexual act he can think of, and that she will do it as gladly, as eagerly, and as skillfully, if that's the right word, as the women he has seen on the screen. I'll interject here that she might not, but she doesn't want her man involved with pornography. So it's important that every man, come to his senses and realize that he is not going to marry the women that are in his fantasies. Challies continues, in the process, it crowds out your ability to relate closely to others, especially and most harmfully, your wife. Pornography has unique power to damage a marriage because it is ultimately about self, not union. Indulging in pornography is a form of psychological isolation, a withdrawal into a tiny world of self-gratification. And I agree with that. I agree with this book very, very much. Pornography makes you less of a man, really, because it's a real man has got to, when he's with a real woman, has got to consider her real needs and wants. And if he's only isolating on his own self-pleasure, that he simply is not going to be a good lover in the bedroom. That is incompatible with being involved with pornography. Challies mentions here on page 24, pornography is a representation of sexuality that promotes either isolating acts of masturbation or abhorrently selfish acts of sexual abuse. He says at the bottom there, page 24, instead, sexual excitement becomes associated with isolation from others and focus on self. That which is supposed to be about sharing becomes all about getting. And I made the remark here in the book, you'll need to overcome the self-centeredness of being involved with pornography before loving your wife. And for some men, maybe they get to be too far gone, and hopefully this podcast, as we go over Tim's wonderful book, Sexual Detox, will be something they come across one day and can begin to take pornography seriously. Page 25, he says, so my primary concern with young married men today, more concerned for their wives or their future wives in the case of single men, is that they may pornify the marriage bed, bringing a foul pollution to that which God intends to be pure, and a rank selfishness to that which God intends to be selfless. And I will just add that instead of asking, what do you want? A person involved in pornography is likely to be saying, just give me my fantasies. There's a section there, interesting thought, marriage is no solution. It's on bottom of page 25. He says, I've spoken to young single men who think that the answer to their reliance on pornography and their addiction to masturbation is marriage. They say, there's just a quote, if I just get married, I can have legitimate sex and all this sin will just go away. Give the guy a legitimate outlet for his desires and he will no longer seek out the illegitimate, right? This may seem like a logical assumption, but it is tragically flawed. He goes on to say there on page 26, it may take weeks or months or even years, but sooner or later it will rear its ugly head once again. He says that at some point it's very likely that the sin will come back to haunt you and to hurt both you and your wife. That's the good thing to remember there, that what was done in secret and in private, the lust, the masturbation, the pornography, it goes into a marriage, and that it can corrupt that marriage and affect that other person. Because if you spent your time with a love doll or a virtual mate, you're not aware of any negative effects because it's all centered on self, and that's just the exact opposite mindset a person needs when they go about getting married. So he is asserting that marriage is no solution, and you can see why it would be. I mean, look at 1 Corinthians 7:2. This is one of the verses, along with Proverbs 5 I mentioned last week, and I'd like to read sometime in this podcast, is that the place that you get your sexual fulfillment is in marriage. It says there, I'm just going from memory now, 1 Corinthians 7:1, is good for man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. So, I mean, ideally, I think a person would get married as young as possible, as early as they could, and then before they get involved with the trappings of pornography, before they get addicted to masturbation and the lust that goes on with that. And the Bible is saying, get married. In fact, it says it's better to marry than to burn. If you're burning, you don't take it out in masturbation, you don't take it out with pornography, because you can't find a wife, and so you justify that this is the only thing you can do. It's not going to help. And if you establish some bad habits going into the marriage bed, then eventually that is likely to come out. And that's why it's so important to deal with ahead of time. Marriage is a place to go to avoid fornication, which is sexual sin, but we don't want to do it after years and years and decades of sexual sin. We are to do that before we get involved with anything like that. He says in page 26, as God makes very clear in his word, sex and the issues surrounding it are fundamentally spiritual in nature. The temptations of pornography engage our minds and bodies in what is primarily a spiritual battle. This battle includes a physical component, but is much more than that. Being tempted to masturbate is probably the most common illegitimate physical expression of this spiritual battle. He says it's an outward expression of how well you have been fighting the inner spiritual battle. He mentions Matthew 5:18 through 20, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. In 27, he mentions the external is just an expression of the internal. That's why replacing masturbation with the marriage bed can never completely work. There needs to be more than a replacement of the physical, mechanical part of sex. There needs to be a replacement of the spiritual part. In the same way, just quitting porn, while it is the right thing to do, is not enough. As in all matters of spiritual growth, you need to replace lies with truth and an unholy practice with a holy one. In other words, in my words, doing it God's way. Now, one of the verses that I thought about when I was struggling, trying to find a wife, wanting to, be pure and avoid sexual sin, in addition to 1 Corinthians 7, 1 and 2, was Hebrews 13:4 says, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. Some say it means the bed should be kept undefiled. It certainly is undefiled. Either way, the marriage bed is a place where anything goes as long as it's something that is mutually satisfying. A marriage bed, once again, is the place to go for legitimate sexual expression. I wanted to tell you or read to you Proverbs 5 because I think you could just replace adultery here with pornography. And a lot of times pornography will lead to adultery. This is Proverbs 5. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Turn your ear to my words of insight, that you may maintain discretion, and your lips may preserve knowledge. For the lips of the adulterous woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end, she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths wander aimlessly, but she does not know it. Now then, my sons, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say. Keep a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you lose your honor to others and your dignity to one who is cruel, lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich the house of another. At the end of your life you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. You will say, how I hated discipline, how my heart spurned correction. I would not obey my teachers or turn my ear to any instructors or to my instructors. And I was soon in serious trouble in the assembly of God's people. And then in verse 15 there, Proverbs 5, it says, drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. And it's talking about your own wife. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares, let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. And then verse 18, may your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer, may her breasts satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love, which is love-making. Why, my son, be intoxicated with another man's wife? Why embrace the bosom of a wayward woman? For your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all your paths. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cords of their sins hold them fast. For lack of discipline they will die, led astray by their own great folly. And so I would add that pornography is most definitely a great folly. On page 28 of the book Sexual Detox, it says there, so getting free and staying free are different things, but they involve the same process. Repentance, putting off the old, putting on the new. You need to practice all three on a regular basis for the rest of your life. And that's just how it is. The next two chapters are on the theology of sexuality. So we're on the same page than the detox part. But first, and this is just ending this chapter 2 in the book, is the think section. And as I said before, I'll go over a couple questions here. And they're good questions. I'll just talk about two of them. Do you believe that masturbation and pornography tend to make you more open and joyful with people in general, or more secretive and isolated? And I think the answer is more secret and isolated, because you're doing something that you're, well, for one thing, ashamed of. That's why normally don't masturbate in public or view pornography in public, and you don't want people to know. Although it's so addictive, people even use it at work. Incredibly, use pornography at work, and definitely you're not going to take your love doll or your virtual mate out in public, because it's a shameful thing, it's a mocking thing, and you're going to do this in isolation. And the great thing in marriage is, you and your wife are there. You respond to each other's thoughts and feelings and words, and you give mutual pleasure, and there is communication, and it's definitely not isolated, and it's definitely not secret when you are making love to your wife. And that's it's just a wonderful thing that the Bible tells people to do, and rather than having sex outside of marriage, rather than masturbating, rather than being involved with pornography. And one of the other questions there in this section was, when it comes to sexual sin, are you more committed to your sin or to obeying God? And since being able to look at the Bible and realize that it actually does talk about these things, and I never really was aware of that until I was probably in my teen years, I know that obeying God always results in blessing, and I know that disobeying God always results in a loss of blessing and even chastisement on top of that. So if you want God's best, then you just simply have to do things His way. So just here of podcast 2 and the second chapter here, Tim Challies' book, Marriage is No Solution to Pornography. While marriage is good and it's something we are to seek to do, it is not something that is going to just whitewash your experiences with pornography away. I hope you have learned something from chapter 2 and the second podcast. There are 6 chapters I'm going to cover from this book, make them into podcasts. Remember that the goal of this book, Sexual Detox, is to try to reset or detox back to a time when porn had little or no hold on you. Tim Challies realizes that you can't be reset back to a state of sinlessness because you were never there. We will always be susceptible to temptation. No program can deliver from the experience of sexual temptation, and like he says, no plan, program, or discipline can guarantee that you will never give in to temptation. This book is about being set free from sexual sin. I also want this to help prevent youth from thinking porn is harmless, so you don't have to be 18 to listen to these podcasts. Well, that's all for today's episode of Casting Beyond the Sea. Thank you for listening. Join us again next time when we will have a look at Chapter 3 of Tim Challies' book, Sexual Detox. He will cover a theology of masturbation, address whether masturbation is right or wrong. We'll talk about why it may be harmful and how to handle the guilt. Please let others know about this podcast series, and by all means buy the book, Sexual Detox, a guide for guys who are sick of porn. We have to talk about this because it will affect the marriage that you have or desire to have someday. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Podbean so you never miss an episode. Plus, if you haven't subscribed to the Love Beyond the Sea YouTube channel, followed us on Facebook or Twitter, make sure to and stay up to date. Make sure to stop by our website and the Community Corner message board to meet other like-minded people who are searching for their love beyond the sea.